They do not control you because they are powerful. They control you because something inside you remains unseen. If influence feels like force, it is because awareness is absent. If persuasion feels like pressure, it is because something within you is already leaning. Manipulation does not begin with the manipulator. It begins with the unexamined parts of your own mind. And until you understand this, you will continue to mistake control for circumstance, when in reality it is alignment, an invisible agreement between your internal vulnerabilities and someone else's external strategy. This is the first truth most people resist. You are not being controlled, you are being read. Every human mind operates through patterns, predictable emotional circuits shaped by memory, fear, desire, and identity. These patterns are efficient. They allow you to move through life without analyzing every decision. But efficiency comes at a cost, predictability. And predictability is where manipulation lives. When someone knows what you fear, they can introduce urgency. When someone senses your need for approval, they can offer validation, then withdraw it. When someone detects your discomfort with conflict, they can apply silent pressure. None of this requires force. It only requires recognition. The manipulator does not need to overpower you. They only need to activate you. And activation is subtle. It feels internal. It feels like your own thought, your own emotion, your own reaction. That is why it goes unquestioned. You think, I need to respond. I shouldn't upset them. Maybe I'm overthinking. But these are not neutral thoughts. They are responses, triggered, shaped, and directed. And the moment you respond without awareness, you are no longer choosing, you are reacting. This is the psychological foundation of control. Unconscious reaction mistaken for conscious decision. To become mentally unavailable to manipulation, you must first understand the architecture of your own mind. At the center of all influence are three core vulnerabilities: the need to be liked, the fear of loss, and the avoidance of discomfort. These are not weaknesses, they are human conditions, but when they operate unconsciously, they become entry points. Consider the need to be liked. It appears harmless, social even, necessary, but beneath it lies a deeper structure, the fear of rejection. And beneath that, an even deeper truth: the mind equates rejection with threat. This is not logical, it is biological. Your nervous system does not distinguish sharply between social exclusion and physical danger. Both register as forms of instability. So when someone subtly withdraws approval, your system responds, not calmly, but urgently. You feel tension, you seek resolution, you adjust your behavior. Not because you consciously chose to, but because something inside you needed equilibrium. And that need can be guided. A manipulator understands this instinctively. They do not announce control. They create conditions that pull your behavior in a certain direction. Approval, then silence. Warmth, then distance. Clarity, then ambiguity. Each shift generates uncertainty, and uncertainty is the most powerful emotional lever because the human mind is designed to resolve it quickly. You begin to overthink, you begin to analyze, you begin to act, not from clarity, but from tension, and in that tension, you become influenceable. Now consider the fear of loss. Loss is not just about people or opportunities. It is about identity. The mind clings to what it believes defines stability: relationships, roles, expectations. When any of these feel threatened, the response is immediate. You compromise, you concede, you tolerate. Not because it aligns with your values, but because it preserves continuity.
This is where manipulation becomes deeply effective. A person does not need to threaten you directly. They only need to create the possibility of loss. A shift in tone, a delayed response, a subtle withdrawal. And suddenly, your mind fills the silence with meaning. Did I do something wrong? Are they pulling away? Should I fix this? Again, the reaction feels self-generated, but it is guided by perceived instability. And when you act to remove that instability, you are no longer grounded in yourself. You are moving toward them. The third vulnerability is the avoidance of discomfort. This is the most invisible and the most dangerous. The mind is designed to seek ease. It avoids tension, conflict, and emotional friction. But growth requires precisely those states, and when you avoid them, you become predictable. If someone knows you dislike confrontation, they can push boundaries quietly. If someone knows you avoid saying no, they can ask repeatedly until compliance becomes easier than resistance. If someone knows you fear emotional tension, they can create it, then offer relief. And relief becomes control. Because once relief is associated with a person, your mind begins to orient toward them as a source of stability. This is not attachment, it is conditioning. At this point, a deeper realization begins to form. Manipulation is not an event, it is a process. It unfolds slowly through repetition and reinforcement. Each interaction builds a pattern. Each pattern strengthens a response. And over time, your reactions become automatic. You no longer question why you feel the need to respond immediately. You no longer notice how often you adjust your behavior to maintain harmony. You no longer recognize the subtle tension that drives your decisions. It becomes normal. And what is normalized is rarely examined. This is why awareness is not a surface-level concept. It is not simply being mindful or thinking before acting. True awareness is structural. It requires you to observe not just your thoughts, but the origin of those thoughts. Where did this urgency come from? Why does this situation feel uncomfortable? What am I trying to avoid right now?
These questions interrupt the automatic process. They create space. And space is the only environment where control dissolves. Because manipulation depends on speed. It depends on your inability to pause. It depends on your immediate reaction. The faster you respond, the less you see. The less you see, the more predictable you become. And predictability is the currency of control. To break this pattern, you must shift from reaction to observation. But this is not easy, because observation feels unnatural at first. It introduces delay, and delay introduces discomfort. The mind interprets this as inefficiency, something to be corrected. You will feel the urge to respond quickly. You will feel the pull to resolve tension immediately. You will feel the need to explain, justify, or fix. But these urges are not instructions. They are impulses. And an impulse only has power when it is followed. There is a moment, small, almost invisible, that exists between stimulus and response. This moment is everything. It is where awareness either appears or disappears. Most people never notice it. Their reactions are immediate, seamless. The stimulus enters, the response exits, and the loop continues. But if you slow down intentionally, you begin to see it. A message arrives, a tone shifts, a request is made, and instead of responding, you observe, not the situation, but yourself within it. What am I feeling? What is being triggered? Why does this feel urgent? This is the beginning of psychological independence. Because the moment you see the mechanism, you are no longer inside it. Mental unavailability is not about becoming cold, distant, or detached from others. It is about becoming unavailable to unconscious influence. It means your responses are no longer dictated by emotional triggers. It means your decisions are not shaped by external pressure. It means your internal state is not easily altered by subtle shifts in someone else's behavior. This is not resistance, it is clarity. And clarity cannot be manipulated. But to reach this state, you must confront a difficult truth. You are not only the target of manipulation, you are also its participant. Not intentionally, not consciously, but structurally. Every time you react without awareness, you reinforce the pattern. Every time you prioritize comfort over truth, you strengthen the loop. Every time you seek external validation, you hand over internal authority. This is not self-blame, it is self-recognition. Because without recognition, there is no change. The path forward is not about learning how others manipulate. It is about understanding why it works on you. Because once the internal mechanism is clear, the external tactic loses its power. A delayed response no longer creates anxiety because you see the trigger. A subtle pressure no longer creates urgency because you understand the pattern. An attempt to influence no longer feels personal because you recognize the structure. And in that recognition, something shifts. You stop reacting. You start choosing. Control does not disappear suddenly. It weakens gradually as awareness strengthens. At first, you will still feel the pull. The tension will still arise. The impulses will still appear. But something will be different. You will see them. And what is seen can no longer operate in the same way, because visibility disrupts automation. And without automation, manipulation has no foundation to stand on, which is precisely where the deeper transformation begins. Awareness exposes the mechanism, but exposure alone does not dissolve it, because what you see, you may still obey. This is the second truth, more uncomfortable than the first. Clarity does not immediately grant control. It only reveals the conflict. You begin to notice the pull, the subtle urgency, the emotional pressure, the internal dialogue that pushes you toward a response. And yet, even as you observe it, there is a part of you that still wants to comply. This is where most people misunderstand growth. They believe that once something is understood, it will disappear. But psychological patterns are not intellectual problems. They are conditioned responses. And conditioning does not vanish through insight alone. It weakens through non-participation. At the core of manipulation lies a simple sequence: trigger, emotion, impulse, action. Most people live inside this sequence without interruption. The trigger activates an emotion, the emotion generates an impulse, and the impulse becomes action so quickly that it feels like a single movement. But this sequence is not fixed. It can be interrupted, not by force, but by delay. Delay is the most underestimated form of psychological power. Because when you delay your response, you create distance between yourself and the impulse. And in that distance, something subtle begins to shift. The emotion is still there, but it is no longer directing you. The impulse is still present, but it is no longer urgent. And without urgency, influence loses its grip. Consider how manipulation relies on immediacy, a message that demands a quick reply, a tone that creates pressure, a situation framed as now or never. These are not random dynamics. They are designed to bypass reflection. Because reflection introduces friction, and friction disrupts control. When you feel rushed, your brain shifts into a reactive state. It prioritizes resolution over accuracy. It seeks relief, not truth. So you respond quickly, not because it is right, but because it reduces tension. This is why delay is not passive, it is strategic. When you pause, even briefly, you force the situation out of the manipulator's timeline and back into your own. And time is control. But delay by itself is not enough. Because if you pause externally while remaining reactive internally, the pattern continues, just slower. True mental unavailability requires a deeper shift, the restructuring of your relationship with emotion. Most people treat emotions as signals that must be acted upon. If they feel anxious, they seek reassurance. If they feel guilty, they seek to correct. If they feel uncomfortable, they seek to escape. But emotions are not instructions, they are information. And information does not require immediate action, it requires interpretation. When someone attempts to manipulate you, they are not controlling your behavior directly. They are influencing your emotional state. And if your emotional state remains unexamined, your behavior will follow automatically. So the question is not, what should I do? The question is, what is this feeling trying to make me do? This single shift changes everything. Because now, instead of moving with the emotion, you begin to study it. Anxiety arises, not as a command to respond, but as a signal of perceived instability. Guilt appears, not as a demand to comply, but as an indicator of internal conflict. Pressure builds, not as a reason to act, but as evidence of external influence. And in observing these states, you reclaim something essential: choice. There is a common misconception that strong people do not feel emotional pressure. This is false. They feel it, often more intensely. The difference is not in the presence of emotion, but in the response to it. They do not obey immediately. They do not interpret discomfort as danger. They do not confuse internal tension with external obligation. They allow the emotion to exist without allowing it to dictate. This is discipline at the psychological level. Not suppression, not avoidance, but containment. Containment is the ability to hold an emotional state without reacting to it, to feel urgency without acting urgently, to feel discomfort without escaping it, to feel pressure without submitting to it. This is not natural at first, because your mind has been trained over years to resolve these states quickly. It associates resolution with relief, and relief becomes the goal. But relief is not always alignment. Often, what relieves you in the moment weakens you in the long term. Responding immediately may reduce anxiety, but it reinforces reactivity. Complying may remove tension, but it strengthens external control. Avoiding conflict may create peace, but it erodes self-respect. So the goal shifts, not from discomfort to comfort, but from unconscious reaction to conscious response. There is a deeper layer to this process, one that is rarely examined. Manipulation does not only exploit emotion, it exploits identity. Who you believe you are determines how you respond. If you see yourself as someone who must be kind at all costs, you will struggle to say no. If you see yourself as someone who avoids conflict, you will tolerate pressure. If you see yourself as someone who needs approval, you will seek validation even when it is conditional. These identities are not fixed truths, they are constructed narratives, and manipulation works by aligning with them. A person does not need to force you to act against yourself. They only need to frame the situation in a way that makes compliance feel consistent with who you believe you are. You're a good person, you'll understand. I thought you were different. I guess I expected more from you. These statements are not direct commands, they are identity triggers. They create a subtle tension between your self-image and your potential response. And to resolve that tension, you adjust your behavior, not because you were controlled, but because you wanted to remain consistent. To become mentally unavailable, you must question these identities, not reject them, but examine them. Ask yourself, is this belief about who I am limiting my ability to act clearly? Am I responding based on truth or on the need to maintain an image? Because the more rigid your identity, the easier it is to influence. Flexibility creates resistance. When you are not attached to a fixed version of yourself, external attempts to define you lose their power. You are no longer trying to prove anything. You are no longer reacting to protect an image. You are simply responding based on clarity. Another mechanism that sustains manipulation is over-explanation. When you feel pressured, you often try to justify your response. You explain your reasons, you soften your boundaries, you add context to make your decision more acceptable. But this behavior, while socially conditioned, has a hidden cost. It signals uncertainty, and uncertainty invites negotiation.
The more you explain, the more openings you create for someone to challenge, reinterpret, or push further. This is not communication, it is exposure, and exposure increases influence. Clarity does not require explanation. A clear response is simple, direct, and grounded. No, I'm not available. That doesn't work for me. These statements may feel uncomfortable because they remove the buffer of justification, but they also remove the possibility of manipulation because there is nothing to negotiate. When your response is rooted in internal clarity rather than external approval, it becomes stable, and stability cannot be easily moved. Silence, too, becomes a form of strength.
not as avoidance, but as control. You do not need to respond to every message immediately. You do not need to engage with every attempt to provoke. You do not need to fill every gap with explanation. Silence creates space, and space shifts power, because the person attempting to influence you now faces something unfamiliar, non-reactivity. And non-reactivity disrupts expectation. Most manipulation relies on predictable responses. When those responses disappear, the strategy loses coherence. The pressure no longer lands. The trigger no longer activates. The pattern breaks. At this stage, something subtle but significant begins to change within you. You are no longer easily pulled into emotional loops. You are no longer driven by the need to resolve every tension. You are no longer interpreting every shift in behavior as something that requires your action. Instead, you observe. You wait.
You choose. And in that shift, your internal environment becomes stable. Not because external situations have changed, but because your relationship to them has. This is the beginning of true psychological independence, not isolation, not detachment from people, but detachment from unconscious influence. You can engage without being absorbed. You can listen without being moved. You can feel without being controlled. And this changes the nature of every interaction, because now the dynamic is no longer based on reaction, it is based on presence. But presence brings its own challenge, because as you become less reactive, others may increase their attempts to influence, not out of malice, but out of habit. They are used to certain responses, they expect certain patterns, and when those patterns disappear, they may push harder. More urgency, more pressure, more subtle emotional cues. This is the test, not of your understanding, but of your consistency. Because mental unavailability is not a state you reach once, it is a practice you maintain. And it is maintained not through effort, but through alignment. When your internal clarity is stable, your external responses become effortless. You do not need to resist. You do not need to defend. You simply do not engage in the same way.
At this point, control begins to dissolve more completely. Not because others stop trying, but because there is nothing left for them to use. No unexamined trigger, no urgent impulse, no rigid identity. Only awareness and choice. And when those two are present together, something irreversible occurs. You become internally directed. Your decisions no longer originate from external pressure. They emerge from internal clarity. And this shift, quiet, subtle, but absolute, is what makes manipulation not just ineffective, but irrelevant. Irrelevance is the final stage, not resistance, not defense, not even awareness as effort, but a state in which manipulation no longer finds a surface to land on, because there is nothing in you that needs to react. At this point, the work becomes quieter, but more precise. You are no longer trying to understand manipulation. You are no longer actively interrupting every internal response. Instead, you begin to refine your internal structure, so that influence does not even initiate the same chain of reactions. This is where mental unavailability becomes identity level. Not something you do, but something you are. To reach this state, you must integrate 3 disciplines: emotional neutrality, cognitive clarity, and behavioral consistency. Each one stabilizes a different layer of your psychology, and together they create a system that cannot be easily penetrated. Emotional neutrality does not mean absence of feeling, it means absence of distortion. You still feel, you still register shifts in tone, energy, and intention, but those signals no longer escalate into narratives. Where before you would feel tension and immediately assign meaning, they're upset, I did something wrong, this could become a problem. Now you feel, and you stop there. No interpretation, no projection, no assumption. Because you understand that the first interpretation is rarely accurate. It is usually a reflection of your conditioning, not reality. This restraint is subtle, but transformative. It prevents the creation of psychological stories that drive unnecessary reactions. And without those stories, manipulation loses one of its most powerful tools, your imagination. Most influence does not come from what is said. It comes from what you fill in. The silence between messages, the slight change in tone, the ambiguity of intention. These gaps invite interpretation, and interpretation, when driven by insecurity or habit, creates internal pressure. You begin to respond not to reality, but to your perception of it. Emotional neutrality closes these gaps. It allows uncertainty to exist without forcing resolution. And when uncertainty is no longer uncomfortable, it can no longer be used against you. The second discipline is cognitive clarity. This is the ability to see situations as they are, without overlay. No emotional coloring, no identity bias, no need for the outcome to be a certain way. Clarity is often mistaken for intelligence, but it is not about how much you know, it is about how little you distort. When someone applies pressure, clarity asks, what is actually being said? What is being implied? What is being assumed? And more importantly, what is not my responsibility here? This question is critical because manipulation often works by expanding your sense of responsibility beyond its natural boundary. You begin to feel accountable for other people's emotions, for their expectations, for their reactions. And in trying to manage these, you lose alignment with yourself. Clarity restores that boundary. You recognize that you are responsible for your actions, but not for how those actions are received. You can be respectful without being compliant. You can be understanding without being controlled. You can be present without being absorbed. The third discipline is behavioral consistency. This is where everything becomes real. Because without consistent behavior, awareness remains theoretical. You may understand your triggers. You may observe your emotions. You may recognize manipulation. But if your actions still shift under pressure, the pattern continues. Consistency means your responses are stable regardless of the situation. Not rigid, not mechanical, but aligned. If something does not work for you, your answer remains the same, whether the request is soft or forceful, whether the tone is kind or manipulative. This removes variability. And without variability, there is nothing to test. Because manipulation is, at its core, a process of testing boundaries. A small request, a slight pressure, a subtle shift. Then, observation. Did you comply? Did you hesitate? Did you explain? Each response provides information, and that information is used to refine the next attempt. But when your behavior is consistent, the feedback loop breaks. There is no adjustment to be made, no strategy to optimize, only a clear, stable response. And stability ends the game. At this stage, your presence changes. Not outwardly dramatic, but internally immovable. You are no longer easily influenced by tone, timing, or emotional cues. You do not rush to respond. You do not seek to resolve every tension. You do not interpret every silence. You allow things to be. And this allowance is often misunderstood. It is not passivity, it is control, because you are no longer compelled to act. There is a quiet power in not needing to respond, in not needing to explain, in not needing to correct every misunderstanding, in not needing to be seen a certain way. This removes the final layer of vulnerability, the need for external validation. As long as you need to be understood, you can be influenced. As long as you need to be liked, you can be guided. As long as you need approval, you can be shaped. But when your sense of self is internally anchored, these needs dissolve. Not completely, but enough that they no longer dictate your behavior. You may still prefer to be understood, but you are not driven by it. You may still appreciate approval, but you are not dependent on it. And this distinction is everything, because dependence creates leverage, and without leverage, control has no entry point. At the highest level, mental unavailability is not about protecting yourself from others. It is about no longer needing protection, because there is nothing within you that can be easily moved. No unexamined fear, no urgent need, no fragile identity. Only awareness stabilized into being. This does not mean you become distant or disconnected. In fact, the opposite occurs. You become more present because you are no longer preoccupied with internal reactions. You listen more clearly. You respond more precisely. You engage without defensiveness. Your relationships become cleaner, not necessarily easier, but more honest, because you are no longer participating in unconscious dynamics. You are no longer adjusting yourself to maintain comfort. You are no longer tolerating misalignment to avoid tension. You are simply aligned. And alignment has a cost. Not everyone will respond well to it. Some will find your lack of reactivity unfamiliar. Some will interpret your clarity as distance. Some will attempt one final time to provoke a response. But this is not a problem to solve. It is a pattern revealing itself. And once seen, it requires no reaction. In the end, the goal was never to control others. It was to understand yourself so deeply that control becomes impossible. Not because you resist it, but because there is nothing left for it to attach to. No automatic reactions, no unconscious agreements, no internal instability. Only a quiet, deliberate mind that sees clearly and chooses carefully. And when you reach this point, something almost paradoxical happens. You stop thinking about manipulation entirely, not because it no longer exists, but because it no longer concerns you. It becomes background noise, visible but irrelevant, like a language you once spoke fluently but no longer use. You recognize the patterns, you see the signals, but they do not move you, because you are no longer operating at that level. This is the final shift, from awareness to control to indifference. Not careless indifference, but grounded, conscious detachment, where your internal state is not shaped by external behavior, where your decisions are not influenced by subtle pressure, where your presence is steady regardless of circumstance. And in that stillness, something becomes unmistakably clear. They were never controlling you. They were only ever interacting with the parts of you that you had not yet understood. Now you do. And because you do, they no longer can.